Subjects of Analysis by Thomas Ogden. Chapter 7. The Concept of Interpretive Action. Part 2. Clinical Illustration 2. Interpretive Action as an early stage of interpretation. During the telephone call prior to our first session, Mr. P told me that his marriage of 18 years was in shambles, that he was in love with and having an intensely passionate affair with the wife of his best friend, and that his life was in a downhill spiral. As the patient entered my consulting room for the initial session, he had the look of a broken man. The intensity of his desperateness and anxiety filled the room. Mr. P handed me a sheaf of papers and explained that these were love poems that he had collected that he thought would help me to understand the feelings that he was having in relation to the woman he had mentioned to me on the phone. The abject surrender that was conveyed in the patient's facial expression and bodily movements as he handed me the papers had the effect of a plea. It felt as if it would be cruel and inhumane not to accept his gesture. I was aware that there was something slightly effeminate about the patient's appearance and manner of speech. Immediately following these momentary initial impressions, but still within the period of seconds during which the patient's hand was outstretched, I developed a distinct sense that the patient was inviting me to engage in a type of sadomasochistic homosexual scene. In this scene, I imagined that I would either submit to him and have his loving contents, concretely represented by the poems, forced into me, or I would be moved to sadistically refuse these contents and thereby demonstrate my power over him, perhaps through a forceful interpretation of the patient's wish to dump his destructive internal objects into me. On the basis of these extremely rapid, hardly verbally symbolized, responses to what was unfolding in the opening seconds of the analysis, I said to Mr. P that it would take some time to understand something of what had just transpired between us, and so I suggested that he keep the poems for now. In the minutes that followed, I became increasingly aware that I had not wanted to touch the papers that Mr. P had offered to me, and had felt an even stronger aversion to the idea of touching Mr. P.'s hand. I had felt that to have accepted the papers would have been to have taken part in the particular form of sexual fantasy that I sensed underlay what was being enacted in his occupying the bed of his best friend. I hypothesized in a highly condensed, hardly articulated way that in having an affair with his best friend's wife, Mr. P had an unconscious fantasy put his penis where his best friend/father's penis had been. In this way, he had had sex with his father while avoiding conscious awareness of the homosexuality of the act because the meeting of his father's penis and his own took place in his mother's vagina. I view my thoughts/hypotheses about the incestuous/homosexual meaning of what had just occurred in the session as a form of reverie by a 1962 that reflected experience of an intersubjective analytic third that was being generated by Mr. P and myself in the course of Mr. P.'s introduction of himself to me. I am mentioning these thoughts for two reasons. First, they formed the basis for more fully elaborated transference interpretations that were discussed with the patient in small bits later in the hour and in the succeeding several sessions regarding the patient's anxiety about beginning analysis with me. The conscious level of the patient's anxieties that were discussed by Mr. P later in the hour related to his fears of breaches of confidentiality, the fantasy of meeting me in situations outside of the analytic setting, and his already knowing things about me from my writing that excited him and made him feel we could have a special relationship with one another. Second, I mention these reveries/hypotheses because I feel that these thoughts and feelings would not have been discernible to me had I reflexively acceded to the patient's offer of the poems in an empathic effort to accept his expression of his need to be understood. Not accepting the poems allowed a psychological space to be created in which the poems could be created and eventually understood as an analytic object, Green 1975. See also Chapter 5. The intervention, the act of not accepting the poems, in conjunction with the tone and content of my comments to Mr. P about my reasons for not accepting them, represented not simply a way to attempt to create analytic space, Ogden 1986, Vitamin 1979. In addition, it represented an early stage of interpretation that communicated the essential elements of what would, in the course of several meetings, be offered as a set of verbally symbolized interpretations. The interpretation in action represented a form of communication of my initial, tentative understanding of the following unconscious transference-countertransference meanings. The intensity and desperateness of the patient's need to put something into me, the papers into my hand, the poetry into my mind and body, reflected his feeling that he could not bear to live with a destructive, out-of-control passion and fear that he felt to be consuming him. He felt that it was imperative that the destructive passion be evacuated into me so that he could be freed of it while remaining connected with it in me. At the same time, I felt that Mr. P wished to make use of me as an analyst in his effort to extricate himself from the web of painful internal and external object relationships in which he felt hopelessly trapped. All of this was discussed with the patient in pieces in the course of the first few sessions, using language very similar to that which I have used here. To summarize, my rather prosaic statement that it would take some time to understand something of what had transpired between Mr. P and me, and my suggestion that he keep his poems for the time being, represented more than an effort to establish an analytic space within which to think about what was being enacted. As importantly, the statement represented a form of transference interpretation in the form of action that emerged from my experience in and of the intersubjective analytic third. My experience in and of the intersubjective third had led me to formulate the opening interaction of the analysis in terms of unconscious, incestuous/homosexual fantasies, by which the patient felt in danger of being overwhelmed. His attempt to hand me the love poems was a highly specific communication about his internal object world. The semantic content of the words I used did not delineate my hypothesis concerning the incestuous/homosexual nature of the unconscious fantasy in which I was being invited to participate. To have offered the interpretation to the patient in a verbally symbolized form at that point would have been to participate in the fantasied sexual drama in the role of the invasive homosexual partner. Nonetheless, my refusal to accept the poems was more than a generic refusal to engage in an acting in with the patient. It was a refusal to take part in the particular unconscious fantasy being experienced in the analytic third, which experience I was formulating for myself in a verbally symbolic form. As a result, my verbal action carried meanings, tentative understandings of the transference-countertransference, that constituted an early stage of what would later be offered to the patient as a verbally symbolized transference interpretation. The subsequent elaboration in words of the understanding initially offered in the form of an interpretive action, as well as the exploration of the meaning to the analysand of the experience of the interpretive action itself, are inextricable parts of this form of interpretive intervention. Clinical illustration 3. Interpretive action in the area of transitional phenomena. In the following example, interpretation in action was offered in the context of a transference-countertransference field in which transitional phenomena, Winnicott 1951, were of central importance. Although the interpretation that will be discussed was presented in the form of a question, the meaning of the interpretation was carried as much by the experience of the intervention as a transitional phenomenon as it was by the semantic content of the words. Dr. L, an analyst in consultation with me, had presented over a period of years a rather difficult case from her practice. The patient, Ms. D, an extremely intelligent woman in her early 30s, had been so crippled by phobias, particularly claustrophobia, and anxiety about her inability to think that she had never been able to work, nor had she been able to pursue graduate-level education. It had taken her 8 years to complete an undergraduate degree. In addition to the phobic symptoms, the patient engaged in compulsive masturbation in which the central fantasy involved being sexually stimulated by several men against her will, usually while she was bound or being threatened. Although the patient occasionally entered into relationships with men, she had had no sexual experiences other than masturbation. Ms. D arrived at a session in her 4th year of analysis, saying that a friend had given her one of the analyst's published articles on psychoanalysis. The patient's friend, who was a graduate student in psychology, had not known the name of Ms. D.'s analyst, since the identity of the analyst was for the patient a closely guarded, shameful secret. Ms. D said that she had not yet read the article because she wanted to discuss her feelings about it and hear the analyst's thoughts with regard to her reading it before going ahead. The patient said that she would like to read the paper aloud, although she was afraid that she would not understand it. The analyst was aware of feeling anxious about the patient's viewing a discourse between herself and her colleagues that felt private. Dr. L told me that she had had the fantasy that she would never again be able to write once this private area had been invaded by the patient. The analyst also had fantasies that the patient would recognize herself in the article despite the fact that Dr. L had never written about her work with Ms. D. In the consultation in which Dr. L discussed this session with me, these countertransference feelings were understood as a reflection of an unconscious fantasy on the part of Dr. L, that the patient had discovered Dr. L's shameful secret of wishing to observe in an excited state her own parents' intercourse. The result would be not only the punishment of being paralyzed in her writing, the recording of her insights, but also of being found out by the patient. The patient's feelings of shame about being in analysis had been tentatively understood and interpreted over time as having roots in the patient's unconsciously fantasized equation of the analytic space and the parental bedroom into which the patient felt she was secretly and excitedly entering. Although the patient discussed the elements of this understanding with considerable interest, it seemed to Dr. L that Ms. D was viewing the interpretations from the outside. In a session some weeks after the patient had been given the journal article, Ms. D said that she had read the paper and had found it interesting to hear the analyst's voice in this different form. Ms. D's excitement, as well as her feelings of competitiveness, envy, and guilt were discussed in some detail. The patient then said that there were several terms and ideas that she had not understood and would like to know more about them. The analyst asked the patient, "What would you like to know?" Dr. L became aware of the ambiguity of her question only after she had posed it. Did she intend to answer any and all of the patient's questions, or was she simply inquiring about the nature of the questions the patient had? Dr. L noted that in the moment of asking this question, she had created in her own mind the imaginative possibility of directly answering the patient's questions, although she had felt no pressure to make a decision about whether or not she would actually do so. Ms. D was startled by the analyst's question, responding to the same ambiguity of which the analyst had become aware, and said that she did not know if the analyst really meant what she had said. Ms. D had during the course of the analysis repeatedly described the loneliness that she had felt during her childhood in not being able to talk to either of her parents or to her siblings about what the hell is going on. "What did you mean by that?" Why did your father say that, etc. Ms. D went on to say that she felt that something important had changed between Dr. L and herself as a result of Dr. L's response, which she had not at all expected. The patient said that she no longer knew what to ask, or even if she wanted to ask anything. Ms. D paused and said that mostly what she had wanted to know was whether the analyst would be willing to talk to her about the things she was confused about, and, surprisingly, the answers to the questions no longer seemed to matter. Dr. L understood the patient's response in terms of Ms. D's conflicted wish to be curious about the private discourse, including the sexual intercourse, of her parents without feeling consumed by it or entrapped in it. The patient was struggling to create in the transference-countertransference an intersubjective potential space, Winnicott 1971b. See also Ogden 1985, in which imagined participation in the parental discourse/intercourse could take place in a different way. In other words, Ms. D was attempting to be curious, to imagine and think about the parental discourse/intercourse, without becoming caught in a perverse, overstimulating psychological event that would have to be either compulsively and excitedly repeated, as in the compulsive masturbation, or fearfully warded off, e.g., by a paralysis of the capacity for thought. Dr. L's response, "What would you like to know?" was spontaneous and highly informed by her experience in the intersubjective analytic third. This intervention stands in contrast to an inquiry into or interpretation of the nature of the patient's conflicted unconscious wish to participate in the extra-analytic, sexual, life of the analyst. Dr. L's response represented an interpretation in action that was generated in a potential space between reality and fantasy. Dr. L's response, interpretive action, conveyed understandings that were utilizably by the patient in a way that had not previously been possible because the response itself represented a form of transitional phenomenon, that is, an intersubjectively created experience in which an emotionally important paradox was created and maintained without having to be resolved. In this instance, the paradox related to the latent question, within Dr. L's manifest question, do you really want to participate in the private intercourse/discourse of your parents/analyst? The question in both its manifest and latent content was recreated intersubjectively in such a way that both analyst and analysand came to experience and understand it as a question, more accurately, a set of questions, for which no answer was required. Under other circumstances, Dr. L's response/interpretive action might have been heard as a frightening, overstimulating invitation to break the law of the father, Lacan 1957. That is, to violate the prohibition against breaches of personal boundaries that are at the foundation of the analytic relationship. The fact that Ms. D experienced the analyst's interpretive action/question as having the qualities of a transitional phenomenon, an intersubjectively created paradox in the form of a question that need not be answered, was reflected in Ms. D's response to the intervention. She did not attempt to compulsively enact voyeuristic fantasies or to actually attempt to further enter into the professional discourse of the analyst, for example, by anxiously seeking out other writings of Dr. L. In this instance, the analyst's formulation of the interpretation in words for herself evolved over time. There was a spontaneous, unplanned quality to the intervention/question, the meanings of which the analyst only began to be able to recognize and consciously formulate for herself in words after, or perhaps as, the question was being posed. This type of interpretive action might be thought of as representing the spontaneous gesture of the analytic third. Dr. L's understanding of her question as a type of transitional phenomenon that generated paradoxical, imaginative possibilities became fully articulated for herself only in the course of consultation. To conclude, the interpretive action under discussion conveyed an understanding of the patient's unconscious conflict, as experienced in and through the intersubjective analytic third, and represented an experience in the area of transitional phenomena. In this instance, it was necessary for the experience of the interpretive action itself to occupy a transitional space wherein new imaginative, as opposed to compulsively fantasied, possibilities could be created intersubjectively. The question, "What would you like to know?" represented an interpretive action that conveyed an understanding of the patient's leading unconscious conflict in such a way that a psychological shift resulted in which the primal scene and the Oedipal drama could be safely created and explored in an area between reality and fantasy. In that third area of experiencing, Winnicott 1951, neither Dr. Ls nor the patient's manifest and latent questions needed to be answered. In fact, it was the conveying of this understanding, i.e., that the questions required no answer, that constituted the interpretation. Summary. In this chapter, the concept of interpretive action is understood as the analyst's use of activity to convey specific aspects of his understanding of the transference-countertransference that cannot be communicated to the patient in the form of verbally symbolic speech alone at the juncture in the analysis when the interpretation in action is made. The understanding of the transference-countertransference conveyed by an interpretive action is derived from the experience of analyst and analysand in the intersubjective analytic third. Although the analyst uses action to communicate aspects of his understanding of the transference-countertransference to the analysand, the analyst simultaneously formulates the interpretation in words for himself. The three clinical illustrations of interpretive action that have been presented were selected not because they represent remarkable or unusual psychoanalytic events. Rather, they have been presented in an effort to illustrate the way in which interpretation in action represents a fundamental, and yet insufficiently explored, aspect of the psychoanalytic interpretive process.